I'm Dr. Nordlof, and these are 10 strategies for self-editing your writing. Okay, so the first strategy, and this might sound pretty basic, but I think it's important to think about as we start here, which is review feedback from previous papers. So I know every time you join a new class or new instructor, sometimes it can be a little, you wonder, well, what are they gonna look for in my writing? But once you've received feedback from the instructor, either in the current class or maybe you've received feedback in previous classes, it can be really helpful to look over that feedback before you write another paper and to gather some thoughts about what did the instructor say, what are the comments here. And sometimes that's one of the most important things you can do. Is why I start with that, because when we're writing as a college student, we're not just writing for ourselves, we're typically writing for an audience which is represented primarily by our instructor. And so what they have to say is going to be important. Now, having said that, sometimes you might read the instructions from your instructor. You might say, oh, gee, I'm not sure exactly what he or she means by this point. And so it's important in those cases, that can be a good point of conversation. Then you might contact your instructor and say, you know what, I'd really like to go over and I was curious about this, and I'm wondering how I can most effectively address some of those issues. But making an attempt at that is going to be important, because typically, for example, I know for myself as an instructor, when I give feedback for a student on a paper, then the next paper I'm kind of looking for that student to incorporate that. It doesn't always happen, but that's ideally, if I'm going to if the student is going to see increased grades, going from a C to a B or B to an A, it's typically going to be because they've made improvements in those areas. So that's number one here. Okay, now number two is, and I'm looking at Chelsea, this is a classic of the Writing Center. And actually all of these, most of the things that we're talking about here are things that we do in the Writing Center, and are strategies that really we find to work. And so I'm going to go over this here with you, but read the essay aloud. And when I say reading aloud, I don't mean like looking at it and reading it in your mind, but actually literally speaking the words so that you or others can hear it. If you feel uncomfortable with that, that's fine, but you maybe have your roommate or somebody else read it aloud. And I say that because I think that one of the things that we find is that although reading, this is a really basic point, but although reading and writing are, speaking and writing are very closely related in some ways, most of us have a much better ear, literally, for words than we do an eye for them. And that has to do with a lot of kind of deep-seated, relationship of speaking as human beings versus reading. We are much more adept at speaking and listening than we are at reading and writing. And so oftentimes what we find in the Writing Center is that when we read aloud and a student hears it, they catch things that they might not have caught by just looking at the page. And so that can be a really powerful tool. And the same thing can be true if somebody reads it to you aloud. You might hear things, not always, but it's you're going to have a good chance of catching some things that you might not have caught otherwise. Third point is what I call reverse outlining. And I'll say just a word about that. Again, this is another strategy that we often use in the Writing Center. And you know what an outline is. You kind of schedule, okay, these are my 3 points, these are my subpoints, and so forth. And many students do that as a way of preparing for writing. And that's fine, and that can be a good strategy. But sometimes you've already written something, you want to say, well, I want to make sure that it's following, does it flow? Does do my points make sense? Are they organized? And one of the things that you can do is what we call reverse outlining. So maybe just have your paper out, be reading it, and try to create an outline based on what you write and see if it does line up with the points that you wanted to make. So, and basically after each paragraph, you might say, okay, what did I say here? And write that down and go through it and then take a look at that. And you might say, okay, did this follow a pattern that makes sense that I was hoping for? Did I maybe include things in a paragraph that were not, two ideas that really weren't quite related or maybe should be spread apart, or areas where something that might be able to be brought to, things maybe at the beginning and the end of the paper are similar points. Maybe you want to combine them or mention them at the same place. Those are things that you might find through, again, reverse outlining. So imagine you're creating an outline from what you've already written. The next one is look to add, if you haven't already, add topic sentences to your paragraph. And what is a topic sentence? A topic sentence is really, it's kind of like a thesis for the paragraph. In fact, they really kind of mean the same thing, only we tend to use the term topic sentence for paragraph level construction. The idea is that your paragraph should have a single idea that you could, that could be expressed in a sentence. I usually like those to come at the beginning of a paragraph. What do I mean by an idea? All that means is not just what you're going to talk about, but what you have to say about that particular topic. So it usually has a subject matter, also maybe your take on that subject matter. I say that because a lot of times writers do not do that, or they kind of follow a line of reasoning in their paragraph, but they never summarize it before they jump into their particular point. And that's something that you can do after. This is a good example of something that you can, in the revision process, you can look back on and say, okay, did I express my main idea in each paragraph? I'll show you an example here. That orange sentence at the top is our topic sentence. And so as you can see here, one point that Atkin makes, that generation Z is more independent and self-competent, while millennials tend to rely too much on their parents' support. Okay, so so this is an idea. We're not just talking about the subject matter is sort of generational differences, let's say. That's a subject, but then the take is, okay, this newer generation is more independent than what came before. Okay, and then you're going to notice here, and then the key thing here is then, okay, now this paragraph is really, that's what the paragraph is going to be about. So in other words, the topic sentence tells me, okay, now what are you going to focus on in this paragraph? And it doesn't get into another topic. But you can add those things to your writing as you go. Okay. Another strategy here for writing is adding paraphrase or explanation after a quotation. So one of the things that writers that I find in college level essay writing is it's important, and this is true at every level, but I want college students to really focus on this, is making sure when you introduce a piece of evidence, a quotation, that you explain it, that you don't just put the evidence into the text and expect the reader to know what to do with it, that you're kind of obligated to explain or put it in your own words. And so you see in this example here, we have here this quotation. This comes from the Bible, right? Jesus said, so I introduced the quotation with this little phrase. Jesus said, comma, quote, do unto others as you would have done unto you, period, unquote. Okay. Now this is an example. You might say, well, this is fairly self-explanatory, you might say, this quotation, but I would say that the language is a little bit, you can see in this version of this, what we call the Golden Rule, a classic passage from the Gospels. It's not exactly language that we use today. This represents probably an earlier form of English expression, especially that word unto. We know what it means, but I never use it in common speech, right? So we might put it in our own words. We might say, this means that you should treat others the way that you would want to be treated. Okay, that's more like how I might talk or how you might talk in common language. And so paraphrase is really kind of doing that. And if you after a quotation, you say, well, how do I do it? Well, try this. The common phrases for paraphrase are either in other words or this means that. Okay, so if you were to if after each quotation, if you just said, in other words, and then think about, well, how else could I say that? And imagine you're explaining the quotation to your roommate or to a friend or to your instructor in your own words. Or do you say this means that, and then do the same thing? Those are good ways to add. What it does is it adds a little bit of depth to your writing, and it deepens your analysis, because you're not just relying on the quotation to tell what you mean, but you're actually explaining it to the reader. It makes it easier for the reader too. Okay. All right. Next here, and this is one, again, we could go into more detail on this, but in terms of the technical aspects of it, but sometimes we find a real common, it's not an error in student writing, but it can lead to less dynamic writing than is necessary, is using the passive voice. And so sometimes if we want to revise our writing and to make it sound a little bit more dynamic, one of the things we can do is look for passive constructions and then revise them. And so I'll talk a little bit about this. It's a little confusing, and again, I know that we could go into more detail, but a passive construction is, first of all, it's not the same as tense. So it doesn't have to do with whether it's past, present, or future, but sometimes people get passive and past confused. So it doesn't have to do with tense in voice, which has to do with time, present, past, but it does have to do with who or what is in the kind of what we call the subject position in a sentence. So typically what we expect in our writing is for the subject position of a sentence to be doing an action. And so usually that's the first, like in a typical active construction, I hit the ball. Okay, so I am the subject and I'm doing an action, which is hitting, and then the ball is the object in a sense. So that's an active construction. But English is kind of neat in that we don't have to structure our sentence that way. We could actually put, if we wanted to, we could put the object in the subject position, and then we would say the ball was hit by me. Okay, so now that subject position, the ball, or the ball, which is really the object of the sentence, is up at the beginning, and then it was hit by me. And you see the example here again. The door was painted by me. Okay, that is passive construction. What you see and what you can do here and you'll notice that because you say, well, the door isn't doing anything, right? The door, and technically what they're doing is you put the object in the front, and then we add a form of to be. In this case, the past form of to be was, and then we use what's called the past participle of the verb, which is usually, although not always, that ed form of the verb, painted, unless it's an irregular verb. And then the subject is actually, the real subject is this me, but me is being stuck in what we call a prepositional phrase at the end, by me. Okay, so what we can do in those situations is we can take the real subject, me, pull it up to the beginning, we change it to I, which is what we typically use for this subjective form of first person, and then use a simple active verb, in this case painted. So I painted the door. Okay, so that's one way. Again, it's not, some people would say, well, always, sometimes you kind of hear, well, prefer the active voice. And yes, there are good reasons to do it. Not always. There's some reasons. Sometimes you want to have that object in the subject position because that's what you're really focusing on in the sentence, and that's fine. But it can make your writing a little bit more dynamic, and it also actually shortens it up a little bit. You can see the passive voice is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words, whereas the active voice is only 4. Okay. Here is another strategy for sentence construction, which is to vary your sentence construction to make your writing more interesting. And sometimes, you're using the same construction all the time, and it sounds repetitive as you're going. And so one of the things that you can do is you can look at your writing and ask, well, what are some ways that I could vary that up? Okay, and one of them is a really simple technique that you can do is to move an adverb. What's an adverb, by the way? Adverbs are these words that modify. They usually modify verbs, and they usually end with ly, although not always. And sometimes they modify other adjectives. But one of the ways you know it's an adverb, actually, you can tell it's an adverb, is that they can be moved. And so in this case, you can see this sentence here: Jeremy searched frantically for his iPhone. Right? Well, frantically, again, that ly word there is, in fact, an adverb. And one of the things that you can notice here is that it's movable. And that's a trick of adverbs that is worth noting. And so it can actually, you can see we have it placed here after searched. Jeremy searched frantically for his iPhone. But it doesn't have to go there. You could say Jeremy searched for his iPhone frantically, or Jeremy frantically searched for his iPhone. In this case, what I'm looking for is to vary the sentence structure. Sometimes if every sentence you're doing is kind of subject verb, Jeremy searched, he went, that kind of thing. You might say, well, how can I vary that up? Well, one of the things you can do is just move. If you have an adverb, just move it to the beginning of the sentence. Frantically, Jeremy searched for his iPhone. Okay, so that's a really easy kind of thing you can do. Also, a lot of sentences contain prepositional phrases, and so a prepositional phrase, they're usually, a lot of them, they're a phrase that begins with a preposition. And if you look up online, like lists of prepositions, they're usually, most of them are these little words like in or on or to, and they usually show, and then the phrase is kind of begins with that preposition and then ends with what we call the object of the preposition. And so it usually shows, they're used in sentences to show usually location or possession. So for example, if I said, let's say I focus on my book here, and the book, on the table, under the table, beside the table, over the table, next to the table, all of those phrases there then are next to the table, under the table, above the table, are all prepositional phrases. These can also be moved around in sentences sometimes. So you can see here, Stephanie was sick with a cold during most of spring break. Okay. So that whole phrase there, during most of spring break, is a prepositional phrase. So we could move that to the beginning of the sentence. During most of spring break, Stephanie was sick with a cold. Okay, and then I'll go one other way of kind of varying your sentence structure is we could use an apositive. And what is that? Well, an apositive is a word or phrase that renames a noun. So, and in sentence structure, oftentimes we have sentences that that might simply be a noun plus some description of the noun linked with is. So I am a writing center director, let's say, or Chelsea is a librarian, let's say. We can take that sentence and we can sort of shove it into another sentence. It's also talking about me. So, for example, if I was to say, Dr. Nordlof is a writing center director. Dr. Nordlof has been at Eastern for 20 years. Let's say almost 20 years. I'll be there this summer. So I could also make that part is a writing center director. I could make that into an apositive. So I could stuff those two sentences together by saying Dr. Nordlof, comma, a writing center director, comma, has been at Eastern for 20 years. Likewise here, Jane is a math tutor. she is helping me study for my calculus exam. Well, you could combine those sentences by just saying, Jane, a math tutor, is helping me study for my calculus exam. Okay. Now, one thing we can do also is we can look for number 8 here. We're getting near the end here. Is to review for specific sentence level errors like comma splices or fragments. And again, one of the things we find in the Writing Center is that this is if students have issues with sentence level issues with their writing, these are some of the most common things that they might encounter. And so I'm going to go over them and just talk a little bit about some fixes for them. So what's a comma splice? A comma splice is just when we have two independent clauses. So these are like complete sentences that have a subject and a verb that are combined simply with a comma. And that's what we call a comma splice. And except for some, sometimes it's mostly considered to be an error in sentence construction. And so sometimes you'll hear, your instructor might say, watch out for the comma splices or that kind of thing. So what do you do? Well, there's a few different things you could do. One is you could just make them two. If it's a comma splice, you could put a period between the two and just instead of a comma, and that would be okay. But it's not the only thing that you can do. There's other ways you could solve it. So you can see this example. We studied for the test all day, comma, we went out at night. Well, that's a comma splice. They're really two separate sentences that you need to combine using one of the kind of standard ways of combining. So you could do something like this. You could say, you could just use a semicolon, and that's acceptable between two, as opposed to a comma. So we studied for the test all day, we went out at night. And by the way, you'll notice here, this is one of those areas where sometimes people miss these things. It's hard to hear these differences. I know I said reading aloud can be helpful, and it can for a lot of things. Some of these punctuation things, you're not necessarily going to hear. What is it? The difference between a period and a semicolon and a comma when you're speaking, they don't exist in the same way. But in writing, these do help us to understand the difference. Okay, so here we could use a semicolon. Or we could use a comma with what we call a coordinating conjunction. And these are these words for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Mostly people use and, but, or, kind of the main, so are the main ones. And if you use that after the comma, that's acceptable. And there's different ways you could do that. You could, like in this one, you said, we studied for the test all day, comma, but we went out at night. That would be acceptable. You could also use and, which would make sense as well. And then a second one that we find oftentimes in the Writing Center is fragments. And a fragment is a word group it's punctuated like a sentence, but it's not. And they're usually, it means, to be an independent clause, to be a sentence, it needs to have a subject, somebody doing something, a verb, what they're doing. And it needs to be able to stand alone as a sentence. Now you can see here this first example, wished he was somewhere else. Okay, now there's a verb there, wished, but there's no subject. Who wished he was somewhere else? So we need to have, that's a real simple solution. You need to add a subject. So James wished. Okay, so those are things. So again, looking out for comma splices or fragments are things that can be, again, as I would say, these are really high likelihood when we see students are struggling at the sentence level, oftentimes, and have errors. Often these are the ones that we're seeing most commonly. Okay. Now here is a tool that I'm going to go over for a few minutes here, and it's called Draft Coach, and we'll talk a little bit about this because this can help you to pick up some of these things as you're going. It's a new tool that we have available. You're in Google Drive, and so this is a tool that you can use. And just to say a couple words, it's a tool that you can use if you're in Google Drive with your Eastern account. So I know some people might have, this is something that's available in Google Drive, but only it's something that our Eastern accounts have available. So if you just have a Gmail account, you probably won't have this available to you. Okay, but how do you access it? Well, first of all, make sure that your document is formatted as a Google Doc. So just if you've uploaded something to Google Drive, just make sure you save it as a Google Doc. And then all you need to do is go over to Tools, or you go over to Add-ons here under the these options here, Add-ons, and then go to Turnitin Draft Coach, and we hit that, and it's going to give you this little bar here, and it actually does a few different things for us. It can do a similarity check, which is basically, this is if you want to know if, sometimes you might say, am I going to have issues? Some people have had issues with plagiarism, and this actually runs basically the same thing that the instructors do through Brightspace when they run Draft Coach. This is one, I'm not going to go over it in detail here, but the citations check helps you to notice, like if you're writing an MLA or APA and you have citations, it keeps track of things so that if you have it in text, did you include the citation at the end and so forth. So that can be helpful. But what I'm going to go over today is just the grammar check. All you have to do is you hit, have your document, then hit Run Grammar Check, and then it will actually go through some things here. And this is, it found some fragments or, run-on sentences. So some of these things, and not all of it is, you're going to read through it, and some things you might say, well, I think that's fine, and but nonetheless, it can help you to pull apart to different specific issues that you might want to then go through and work on your own. Okay, so that's something else that you can do. My last point is I will encourage, I think a good strategy for us is to consider visiting a writing center. And again, as I said at the beginning, I'm a director of Writing Center, and a lot of these are strategies that we work on with students when you meet with us. And so I think sometimes, and I think it can be helpful to do so. And I'm just going to mention a couple of things here. The links I've put in here, one is this Eastern link is actually eastern.edu is the link to our Writing Center page on the Eastern website. You can go there and get information. If you're a traditional undergraduate student, there's information about how to access our online appointment calendar. But you can also go directly to our online appointment calendar, eastern.mywconline.com. And if we go to that page, you can actually sign up for an appointment. And you can, when you first join, you do need to register for an account. So if you click on that, it'll ask you, you need to use your Eastern email, otherwise it won't work. And then you do need to make your own password. So it's not just like, I know people get confused. It's not just using the same password you use for your email, unless you set it up that way. Okay, but once you've set up an account, you can go here, and then you're going to see, okay, there are pages. If there's a white space here, you can click on it, and there's times, and then you can make an appointment, and you can see you just have to fill out some information here about the session and what you want to do. Many of these are online, and if they're online, it means that you're going to meet the tutor online, and you actually just go, when you have an appointment, you just go back to this spot and you click on Start or Join Online Consultation. But some of the appointments during the day are available to be either online or in person, which is in our Writing Center in Walton 205. So in this case, you can see this appointment tomorrow with Zach is available for either face-to-face, you'd need them in person, or online. Okay, so those are our 10 tips there. One of the things I will say is, just to kind of wrap that up, you can see that there's a variety of strategies that you can use. And I think again, the most important thing is to make sure that you're following, taking in the instructor's comments, talk with the instructor, get feedback from, if you're still confused, again, bring your paper to the Writing Center, bring your comments from the instructor. Sometimes it can help to work over with another student that reading your paper aloud is a good self-editing strategy. And then these, using these other tools that we've gone over. And don't try to do it all at once. I think that, there's each of these tools can be used as a separate step in the process. I think if you try to do too much at one time with your writing, you can get overwhelmed. And so, kind of say, maybe I'll try one of these strategies for today or for this paper and so forth.